On July 16, 1945, at exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, two men met for the first time under circumstances that would shape the fate of the free world. One was a 70-year-old British lion who had just led his nation through its darkest hour. The other was a 61-year-old haberdasher from Missouri who had been president for exactly 95 days. What Winston Churchill said after that meeting, and what Harry Truman wrote in his secret diary, reveals a moment of profound transformation in world history. This is the story of that encounter and the man who saved Western civilization. Let's begin with where Harry Truman was just 3 months earlier. On the afternoon of April 12, 1945, Vice President Truman was doing what he usually did as President of the Senate. He had just adjourned the session for the day and was heading to House Speaker Sam Rayburn's office for what they called the Board of Education, an informal gathering where they would have a bourbon and discuss the day's events. Truman had been vice president for exactly 82 days. Just 82 days. He had met with President Franklin Roosevelt only twice during that entire time. Roosevelt, whether out of denial about his failing health, or simply following the tradition of keeping vice presidents in the dark, had told Truman almost nothing about the critical decisions being made to win the war and shape the peace. As Truman settled into Rayburn's office, the phone rang. It was Steve Early, Roosevelt's press secretary, with an urgent message. The vice president needed to come to the White House immediately. Truman assumed it was just another meeting. He told his driver there was no need to hurry. When he arrived at the White House and was quickly ushered upstairs to Eleanor Roosevelt's study, he found her standing there with her arm around her daughter Anna. Eleanor Roosevelt looked at him and said quietly, "Harry, the president is dead." For a moment, Truman couldn't speak. Then he asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor Roosevelt's response would become one of the most famous exchanges in American presidential history. "Is there anything we can do for you?" she replied. "For you are the one in trouble now." That evening, at 7:09 p.m., in the cabinet room of the West Wing, Harry S. Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States by Chief Justice Harlan F. Stone. His wife Bess stood beside him, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Later, he would tell reporters something that captured the overwhelming nature of what had just happened. "I don't know if you fellas ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." But Truman had no time to process his shock. The war in Europe was reaching its final days. American and Soviet troops were closing in on Berlin, and there was still Japan to deal with in the Pacific, where American casualties were mounting with every island battle. Here's what makes Truman's situation even more extraordinary. The world he inherited was vastly different from anything any previous American president had faced. The United States was no longer the isolated nation that had tried to stay out of European affairs. American troops were scattered across the globe. The nation had transformed into the world's greatest military and industrial power. And yet Truman knew almost nothing about Roosevelt's plans for the post-war world. He didn't know about the secret agreements made at Yalta. He didn't know the details of Roosevelt's relationship with Stalin. And most importantly, he didn't know about the Manhattan Project. It wasn't until his first full day as president that Secretary of War Henry Stimson pulled him aside and told him that the United States was developing a weapon of unprecedented power, something called an atomic bomb. Who was this man who now had to fill Roosevelt's shoes? Harry Truman was born on May 8, 1884, in Lamar, Missouri, to a farming family. His father was a livestock trader, and young Harry grew up working on the family farm near Grandview. Unlike Roosevelt, who was born into wealth and privilege at Hyde Park, Truman knew what it meant to work with his hands. He plowed fields, tended livestock, and rose before dawn to do his chores. His eyesight was so poor that he couldn't play sports with other boys, so he became a voracious reader instead. By the time he was 14, he had read every book in the Independence, Missouri Public Library, many of them twice. He particularly loved history and biography. He could tell you about the campaigns of ancient generals, the rise and fall of empires, and the lives of great leaders from memory. When World War I came, Truman was already in his 30s, technically too old for combat, and his eyesight should have disqualified him. But he memorized the eye chart and enlisted anyway. He went to France as an artillery captain in 1918 and led Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery in combat. His men remembered him as a tough, decisive leader who didn't panic under fire. When they came home, Truman tried to make it as a businessman, opening a haberdashery in Kansas City with his war buddy Eddie Jacobson. The store failed during the recession of 1921, and Truman spent years paying off the debts. He refused to declare bankruptcy, insisting on honoring his obligations. This financial failure hung over him, and his political enemies would later mock him as a failed shopkeeper. His entry into politics came through the Pendergast machine, the Democratic political organization that controlled Kansas City. Tom Pendergast was a classic political boss, corrupt but effective. Truman was elected as a county judge in 1922, essentially an administrative position overseeing roads and public works. He earned a reputation for honesty and competence, even while working for a corrupt political machine. In 1934, when Pendergast needed someone to run for the Senate, he chose Truman. Truman won, but many in Washington looked down on him as the senator from Pendergast. They assumed he was just another machine politician. Truman proved them wrong. In the Senate, he worked hard, showed up for every vote, did his homework on legislation, and built a reputation for integrity. When World War II began, and the nation started spending billions on defense contracts, Truman became concerned about waste and corruption. In 1940, he drove his old Dodge automobile 30,000 miles across the country, visiting defense plants and military bases, seeing problems firsthand. He came back and convinced the Senate to create a special committee to investigate defense spending. The Truman Committee, as it became known, saved the taxpayers an estimated $15 billion and made Truman a national figure. In the spring of 1904, journalists in Washington rated his contribution to the war effort second only to Roosevelt's. So, when Democratic Party leaders were looking for someone to replace Vice President Henry Wallace on the ticket in 1904, they settled on Truman as a compromise. Wallace was too liberal for the Southern Democrats and Conservative Party bosses. James Burns of South Carolina was too conservative for labor unions. Truman was acceptable to everyone. Roosevelt himself didn't really know Truman well and probably would have preferred to keep Wallace, but he went along with the party bosses. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Truman was nominated for vice president. He didn't campaign much for the position and told friends he would have preferred to stay in the Senate where he felt useful. But Roosevelt and Truman won easily in November 1904, defeating Republican Thomas Dewey. And then came the strangest vice presidency in American history. Roosevelt met with Truman only twice between the inauguration in January and Roosevelt's death in April. The president made no effort to brief his vice president on anything of importance. Truman presided over the Senate, went to parties and receptions, and felt increasingly useless. He later said that Roosevelt had done both him and the nation a great disservice by keeping him in the dark. Roosevelt perhaps didn't realize how sick he was, or maybe he was in denial, but he left his successor completely unprepared for what was coming. Now, jump forward to May 1945. Germany had surrendered on May 8th, less than a month after Truman took office. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime had collapsed. But the war in the Pacific continued, and it was getting bloodier. American forces had taken Iwo Jima in March after a month of brutal fighting that killed nearly 7,000 Americans. The battle for Okinawa began in April and was still raging through May and June. By the time it ended, over 12,000 Americans had died, and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and 75,000 Okinawan civilians were dead. These casualty figures terrified American military planners who were drawing up plans for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Estimates range from 200,000 to over 1 million American casualties, with Japanese military and civilian losses potentially in the millions. The big three leaders, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, needed to meet to discuss how to end the war with Japan and how to organize the peace in Europe. Joseph Stalin insisted the meeting take place in Soviet-occupied territory, and he chose Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin. Truman didn't want to go. He hated being away from Washington. He wrote in his diary as he prepared for the trip, "How I hate this trip," but he knew he had no choice. On July 6, 1945, Truman boarded the USS Augusta, the same heavy cruiser that had carried Roosevelt to the Atlantic Conference 4 years earlier, and began the journey across the Atlantic. For 8 days at sea, Truman worked constantly. He read briefing books on every issue that would come up at the conference. He met with Secretary of State James Burns, Admiral William Leehy, and other advisors. He studied maps of Europe and the Pacific. He prepared himself for the moment when he would have to negotiate face-to-face with two of the most formidable leaders of the 20th century, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. At night, he relaxed by playing poker with his staff, and as he later noted, it was good training for high-stakes diplomacy. The Augusta docked at Antwerp, Belgium on July 15th. From there, Truman flew to Berlin. Looking out the window of the plane, he saw city after city that had been bombed into ruins. When he landed and drove toward Potsdam, he traveled down a highway lined with Soviet soldiers standing every 20 feet, their rifles bristling with bayonets. The display of military might was Stalin's way of showing who controlled this part of Germany. Truman's temporary residence was a villa at 2 Kaiserstrasse in the Babelsberg suburb of Potsdam. The house had been looted 10 weeks earlier by Red Army soldiers who had beaten the elderly owners and raped their daughters. The Soviet occupation forces had evicted the family and given the house to the Americans for the conference. This was the reality of the Soviet zone. Truman arrived on the evening of July 15th, exhausted from travel. That night, Churchill called and asked if he could pay a visit the next morning. Truman, who had been up since before dawn, agreed to meet at 11 a.m. on July 16th. As Churchill's daughter Mary later recalled, her father was up unusually early that morning. Churchill had a well-known habit of working late into the night and sleeping late in the morning, sometimes not rising until noon. But this was too important. He needed to size up the new American president. Winston Churchill, at age 70, looked every bit the British bulldog he had become in popular imagination. He was shorter than most people expected, stocky, with thinning reddish hair, piercing blue eyes, and that famous jutting jaw. He wore his usual attire, a dark suit with a bow tie and a gold watch chain across his vest. He had led Britain through the darkest days of the war, from Dunkirk through the Blitz, from the desperate days of 1940 when Britain stood alone, to this moment of victory. His oratory had rallied the British people. His stubbornness had kept Britain in the fight when some wanted to make peace with Hitler. His partnership with Roosevelt had been one of the most important relationships of the war. But Churchill was also a worried man that morning. 10 days earlier, on July 5th, British voters had gone to the polls in a general election. Churchill and the Conservative Party were confident of victory. After all, Churchill had just won the war. But the votes of British soldiers serving overseas hadn't been counted yet, so the results wouldn't be known until July 26th. More immediately, Churchill was anxious about this new American president. Who was Harry Truman? Could he be trusted? Would he stand up to Stalin? Or would he try to appease the Soviets the way Neville Chamberlain had tried to appease Hitler? Churchill knew that Britain's future depended on maintaining the special relationship with America. Britain was exhausted and nearly bankrupt from 6 years of war. Its cities had been bombed, its people were tired, and its treasury was empty. Britain needed American support to maintain its position in the world. Churchill had developed an extraordinary relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. They had exchanged nearly 2,000 messages during the war. They had met 9 times at major conferences. Roosevelt had called Churchill "my friend," and Churchill had said meeting Roosevelt was like opening a first bottle of champagne. But Roosevelt was gone. Now Churchill had to forge a new relationship with this unknown quantity from Missouri. At precisely 11 a.m. on July 16th, Winston Churchill arrived at Truman's villa. The two men shook hands and sat down for what would become a 2-hour conversation. Churchill immediately launched into what he did best, pouring on the charm. He talked about how great America was, how much he had loved Franklin Roosevelt, and how much he intended to love and work with President Truman. He praised American power and American ideals. He spoke of the unbreakable bonds between Britain and the United States. It was vintage Churchill, eloquent and persuasive. But Harry Truman was not buying it. Or rather, he saw exactly what Churchill was doing and wasn't sure he liked it. Truman had spent years in politics. He had worked with Tom Pendergast's machine. He had negotiated with senators and dealt with lobbyists. He knew when someone was trying to flatter him. After Churchill left, Truman sat down and wrote in his secret diary, a journal he kept on scraps of paper that wouldn't be discovered by historians until 1978, more than 30 years after the conference. Here's what Truman wrote, and these are his exact words. To get down to today, Mr. Churchill called by phone last night and said he'd like to call for me to set the hour. I did for 11 a.m. this morning. He was on time to the dot. His daughter told General Vaughan he hadn't been up so early in 10 years. I'd been up for 4 hours. We had a most pleasant conversation. He is a most charming and a very clever person, meaning clever in the English, not the Kentucky sense. He gave me a lot of hooey about how great my country is, and how he loved Roosevelt, and how he intended to love me, etc., etc. Well, I gave him as cordial a reception as I could, being naturally, I hope, a polite and agreeable person. I am sure we can get along if he doesn't try to give me too much soft soap. You know, soft soap is made of ash hopper lye, and it burns to beat hell when it gets into the eyes. It's fine for chigger bites, but not so good for rose complexions. But I haven't a rose complexion. That passage tells you everything you need to know about Harry Truman. He was polite, he was cordial, but he wasn't fooled. He saw through Churchill's flattery. The reference to soft soap, made from lye that burns when it gets in your eyes, shows his farm background. He was a man who spoke in plain Midwestern metaphors. But notice also what else is there. Truman said Churchill was clever in the English sense, not the Kentucky sense. In Kentucky and throughout the rural South, calling someone clever meant they were sneaky or untrustworthy. But Truman acknowledged that Churchill was clever in the British sense, meaning intelligent and skillful. He respected Churchill's abilities even while being skeptical of his motives. Now, let's look at what Churchill thought of Truman. After that 2-hour meeting, Churchill walked back to his residence at 23 Ringstrasse, about 400 yards away. His daughter Mary was waiting for him, serving as his aide-de-camp during the conference. Churchill's wife Clementine had stayed home in England, so Mary was there to support her father. As they walked together, Churchill told Mary his impressions. He called Truman a man of immense determination. He said Truman takes no notice of delicate ground. He just plants his foot down firmly upon it. To demonstrate, Churchill actually jumped a little off the floor and brought both feet down with a smack. Mary Churchill was so relieved by her father's reaction that she immediately wrote to her mother. "He says he is sure he can work with him," Mary wrote. "I nearly wept with joy and thankfulness. It seemed like divine providence. Perhaps it is FDR's legacy. I can see Papa is relieved and confident." Think about what Mary Churchill was expressing in that letter. She nearly wept with joy. The future of Britain, the future of Western Europe, might have hung on whether these two men could work together. And after that first meeting, Churchill believed they could. What was happening in that encounter went far beyond two-bit or politicians sizing each other up. This was a moment of generational and cultural transition. Roosevelt had been born into the American aristocracy. He grew up at Hyde Park with servants, went to Groton and Harvard, spoke with a patrician accent, and moved easily in the world of international diplomacy. Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace, the grandson of a duke, educated at Harrow and Sandhurst, a man who had been a soldier, war correspondent, and politician since the Victorian era. These two men shared a similar class background and worldview. Harry Truman came from a completely different world. He was a dirt farmer from Missouri. He had never been to college. He spoke with a flat Midwestern accent. His suits were cheap, and his shoes were described as two-toned and jaunty. He had no family fortune, no aristocratic background, no inheritance except debt from a failed business. He was, in every way, a common man who had risen through vast work and determination. And now, this common man sat across the table from the British Lion and refused to be intimidated or bamboozled. But something else was happening in that meeting that was even more significant. Britain and America were changing positions. For more than a century, Britain had been the dominant power in the Western world. The British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. British diplomacy shaped world affairs. The City of London was the center of global finance. Even during World War II, Churchill had insisted on being treated as an equal partner, with Roosevelt and Stalin in the Big Three. But the reality was that Britain was no longer a superpower. The war had exhausted Britain's resources. Its empire was beginning to crumble. India was demanding independence. British industry had been severely damaged by the war. The nation was deeply in debt, much of it owed to the United States. America, by contrast, had emerged from the war as the world's dominant power. The American economy had not been damaged by the war. In fact, it had grown stronger. American industry was producing half the world's manufactured goods. The American military was the most powerful fighting force on Earth. with millions of men under arms and a navy larger than all other navies combined. And America was about to possess something that would change the balance of power forever. While Truman was sailing across the Atlantic on the USS Augusta, something extraordinary was happening in the New Mexico desert. On July 16th, the same day Truman met Churchill, at 5:29 a.m. Mountain Time, the world's first atomic bomb was detonated at the Trinity test site near Alamogordo. The explosion released the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. A fireball rose into the sky, and a mushroom cloud climbed to over 7 miles high. The scientists who witnessed it were awed and terrified. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, would later say that as he watched the explosion, words from Hindu scripture came to his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." News of the successful test was sent to Truman at Potsdam in code. On July 17th, the day before the conference officially began, Truman received a telegram that read, "Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations." A few days later, he received more details. The bomb worked. It was more powerful than anyone had dared hope. America now possessed a weapon that could destroy an entire city with a single explosion. This changed everything at Potsdam. Truman now had an ace in the hole, as he put it in a letter to his wife. The question was how to use it, not just against Japan, but as a diplomatic tool with Stalin. On July 17th, the day after meeting Churchill, Truman met Stalin for the first time. Stalin arrived at Truman's villa a few minutes before noon, right on schedule. Truman rose from his desk and went forward to greet him. Stalin, who was only about 5 feet 5 inches tall, wore a fawn-colored military uniform with red epaulets. His face was pockmarked from childhood smallpox, and the whites of his eyes had a yellowish tinge, but he smiled and shook Truman's hand firmly. Truman was direct with Stalin in a way that might have surprised Roosevelt. He told Stalin that he was no diplomat, that he usually just said yes or no to questions after hearing all the arguments, and that he expected straight answers. Stalin seemed to appreciate this blunt approach. They talked about the war and about the Soviet Union's promise to enter the war against Japan. Stalin said that Soviet forces would invade Manchuria by mid-August, keeping the commitment he had made to Roosevelt at Yalta. Truman, not knowing if the atomic bomb would work, was relieved. If the bomb failed, he would need the Red Army to help defeat Japan. But Truman also saw something in Stalin that day that troubled him. He invited Stalin to stay for lunch. The menu was liver and bacon. When an aide asked Truman if he should invite Stalin to lunch, Truman asked what they were having. When told liver and bacon, Truman said, "If liver and bacon is good enough for us, it's good enough for them." Stalin accepted and stayed. They washed down the meal with California wine, which Stalin claimed to enjoy. But what Truman saw at that lunch was a dictator who smiled easily, but whose eyes remained cold and calculating. After Stalin left, Truman wrote in his diary that he believed he could deal with Stalin, that Stalin was honest, but smart as hell. Over time, Truman would revise that assessment. The Potsdam Conference officially began at 5:10 p.m. on July 17th at the Sicilienhof Palace. The oak-paneled reception hall had been set up as a conference room, with a large round table covered in red cloth. Each of the big three leaders had his own entrance, each heavily guarded by Soviet soldiers. Stalin opened the meeting by proposing that President Truman chair the conference, since he was the only head of state present. Churchill seconded the motion. It was a gesture of respect, but it also meant that Truman would have to manage the competing demands and personalities of Churchill and Stalin. The conference discussions were often contentious. The biggest issues were the future of Germany and the question of Poland. Stalin wanted heavy reparations from Germany, half of which would go to the Soviet Union. He also wanted to keep the Polish borders exactly as the Red Army had established them, which meant incorporating large chunks of eastern Germany into Poland and forcing millions of Germans to move west. Truman and Churchill resisted Stalin's demands, arguing that Germany needed to be rebuilt economically and that the German population couldn't be brutally uprooted. The arguments went back and forth for days. Stalin was immovable. He controlled the territory on the ground, and he knew it. Churchill grew increasingly frustrated. He and Eden had hoped to use the conference to roll back Soviet control in Eastern Europe, but it quickly became clear that Stalin had no intention of giving up what his armies had conquered. At one point, Churchill wanted to insist that the nations liberated from Nazi control should hold free elections immediately. Stalin responded by asking if Churchill was accusing him of bad faith. The atmosphere grew tense. Then came one of the most famous moments of the conference. On July 24th, after a session had ended, Truman walked over to Stalin and casually mentioned that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He didn't specifically say atomic bomb, he just said a new weapon. Stalin's face showed no particular reaction. He simply said he was glad to hear it and hoped the United States would make good use of it against the Japanese. Then he turned and walked away. Truman and Churchill had been watching Stalin carefully for his reaction. Churchill later wrote that Stalin seemed to have no idea of the significance of what he had been told. In his intense toils and stresses, the atomic bomb had played no part in Stalin's calculations. If he had had the slightest idea of the revolution in world affairs that this weapon would bring, Churchill wrote, he would never have been so casual about it. But Churchill and Truman were wrong. Stalin knew exactly what they were talking about. Soviet spies in the Manhattan Project had been feeding information to Moscow for years. Stalin knew about the bomb before Truman did. He just didn't let it show. The conference continued through the rest of July, but it was interrupted by a stunning political development. On July 26th, the results of the British election were announced. Churchill's Conservative Party had lost in a landslide to the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee. Churchill was stunned. He had just won the war, and the British people had voted him out of office. It was one of the great ironies of history. The man who had saved Britain from Hitler couldn't even win an election. Churchill flew back to London that day and never returned to Potsdam. Attlee took his place for the remainder of the conference. For Truman, this was another shock. He had just begun to establish a working relationship with Churchill, and now he had to start over with Attlee, who was much less experienced in international affairs. But the conference ground on to its conclusion. On August 2nd, 1945, the Potsdam Conference officially ended. The agreements reached were mixed at best. Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Reparations would be taken from each zone separately. The Polish borders would remain roughly as Stalin wanted them. The details of peace treaties with Germany's former allies would be worked out by a council of foreign ministers. But what Truman brought home from Potsdam wasn't really the official agreements. It was a clear understanding of the nature of the Soviet regime and Joseph Stalin. Truman had seen firsthand how Stalin operated, how he maneuvered, how he twisted language and facts to serve his purposes. The working relationship that Roosevelt had tried to maintain with Stalin was over. Truman didn't trust Stalin, and he never would. This realization would shape American foreign policy for the next 40 years. On August 6th, 4 days after the conference ended, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The blast instantly killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people and destroyed most of the city. Truman was sailing home on the USS Augusta when he received word that the mission had succeeded. He was having lunch in the officer's mess when a message was handed to him. He read it, looked up, and said, "This is the greatest thing in history." He immediately went to find his staff and told them the news. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people instantly. On August 14th, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The decision to use the atomic bomb remains one of the most controversial in history. Critics have argued that it was unnecessary, that Japan was already defeated and would have surrendered without the bombings. Some have said that Truman wanted to use the bomb primarily to intimidate the Soviet Union and that Japanese civilians were sacrificed as part of the opening gambit of the Cold War. Others have accused the United States of racism, arguing that such a weapon would never have been used against white Europeans. Truman defended his decision for the rest of his life. He argued that a conventional invasion of Japan would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and potentially millions of Japanese lives. He pointed to the casualties at Iwo Jima and Okinawa as evidence of how fanatically the Japanese military would defend the home islands. He noted that even after the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the Japanese military leadership wanted to continue fighting. It took 2 bombs and the Soviet declaration of war on Japan to finally convince Emperor Hirohito to overrule his generals and agree to surrender. Truman said he never lost a night's sleep over the decision. Whether one agrees with that decision or not, It's clear that Truman believed he was doing what was necessary to end the war and save lives. But the atomic bomb did more than end World War II. It fundamentally changed the nature of international relations. The nuclear age had begun, and it would be Harry Truman and Winston Churchill, working together despite their very different backgrounds and personalities, who would shape the Western response to the Soviet challenge in the nuclear era. In March 1946, Truman invited Churchill to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Truman himself introduced Churchill, giving the event enormous significance. Churchill delivered what would become known as the Iron Curtain speech, warning that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Behind that line, Churchill said, lay all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe, and they were subject to Soviet domination. The speech was controversial at the time. Many Americans thought Churchill was being too alarmist, that he was trying to drag the United States into British imperial conflicts. But Truman supported the speech. He had read it beforehand and approved of its message. Within a year, events would prove Churchill right. In March 1947, Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support for free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This was the formal beginning of the Cold War policy of containment. In June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced the Marshall Plan, offering massive American economic aid to rebuild Western Europe. Churchill wrote to Truman praising both initiatives and thanking him for saving Western civilization. The relationship between Churchill and Truman deepened over the years. When Churchill visited Washington in January 1952, near the end of Truman's presidency, the two men had dinner together. Churchill admitted that he had been pessimistic when Truman succeeded Roosevelt. He had doubted whether this unknown senator from Missouri could fill Roosevelt's shoes. But Churchill told Truman that evening, "I misjudged you badly. Since that time, you, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization." Coming from Winston Churchill, who had himself saved Western civilization in 1940, that was the highest praise imaginable. What had Truman done to earn such praise? He had done exactly what Churchill had sensed in that first meeting at Potsdam. He had planted his foot down firmly and refused to be moved. He had stood up to Stalin. He had recognized that the Soviet Union was not a partner for peace, but an expansionist power that needed to be contained. He had marshaled American economic and military power to rebuild Western Europe and create a defensive alliance through NATO. He had fought and fired General Douglas MacArthur to preserve civilian control of the military. He had desegregated the armed forces. He had recognized the State of Israel. He had made the decision to develop the hydrogen bomb to maintain America's nuclear deterrent. And he had done all of this while remaining true to his Midwestern values of plain speaking, hard work, and integrity. Truman left office in January 1953 with approval ratings at historic lows. The Korean War had become a bloody stalemate. The economy was struggling with inflation. McCarthyism was poisoning American politics. Truman was criticized from all sides. But as the years passed and historians gained access to documents and could see the full scope of what Truman had faced and how he had responded, his reputation grew. Today, historians consistently rank Harry Truman among the greatest American presidents, usually in the top 10, sometimes in the top 5. That first meeting at Potsdam on July 16, 1945, was the beginning of that legacy. Two men from vastly different worlds met in the ruins of Nazi Germany and found that they could work together. Churchill saw in Truman something that many others had missed, a man of immense determination and courage. Truman saw in Churchill a man whose charm and eloquence masked but didn't hide his true qualities: stubbornness, strategic vision, and an unshakable commitment to freedom. Neither man was fooled by the other's style. Churchill knew that Truman wouldn't be flattered or manipulated. Truman knew that Churchill's grand rhetoric served real strategic purposes. What makes their relationship so remarkable is that it worked despite everything that should have divided them. Churchill was the aristocrat who had attended the finest schools and moved in the highest circles of British society. Truman was the dirt farmer who had failed at business and scraped his way up through machine politics. Churchill spoke in soaring Shakespearean prose. Truman spoke in blunt Midwestern sentences. Churchill worked late into the night and slept late in the morning. Truman rose before dawn and went to bed early. Churchill drank whiskey throughout the day. Truman had an occasional bourbon, but was usually moderate. Churchill loved painting and bricklaying for relaxation. Truman played the piano and took long walks, but they shared something more important than their differences. They both believed in democracy and freedom. They both understood that totalitarianism, whether Nazi or communist, was an existential threat to Western civilization. They both had the courage to stand up for their beliefs even when it was unpopular, and they both had been tested by fire. Churchill in the dark days of 1940, when Britain stood alone. Truman in those first overwhelming months after Roosevelt's death, when he had to make decisions that would affect billions of people. The man who saved the world, as Churchill called Truman, was in many ways an unlikely hero. He had no natural advantages. He wasn't wealthy or well-born or particularly charismatic. He didn't have Roosevelt's magnetism or Churchill's oratory. What he had was something more fundamental: courage, integrity, and an unshakable belief in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. When he wrote in his diary that Churchill had given him a lot of hooey, that soft soap made from lye burns when it gets in your eyes, he was showing us who he really was. He was a man who saw through flattery, who understood that leadership required substance over style, and who knew that Missouri common sense was just as valuable as British aristocratic polish. And when Churchill walked back to his residence that day and told his daughter Mary that he was sure he could work with Truman, that Papa was relieved and confident, we see the other side of that relationship. Churchill recognized in Truman qualities that others had overlooked. He saw past the cheap suits and the Midwestern accent to the steel underneath. He understood that this man who planted his foot down firmly and took no notice of delicate ground was exactly the kind of leader the free world needed in the dangerous years ahead. The atomic age that began at Potsdam brought new terrors to the world. The threat of nuclear war would hang over humanity for decades. The Cold War would create crises from Berlin to Korea to Cuba. But because Harry Truman and Winston Churchill forged a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values, because they created the institutions and alliances that would defend freedom, and because they had the wisdom to contain Soviet expansion without triggering World War III, Western civilization survived. That's why Churchill was right to say that Truman, more than any other man, had saved it. When Truman died in December 1972 at age 88, the tributes poured in from around the world. But perhaps the most fitting epitaph had been written years earlier by Churchill himself. "I misjudged you badly," Churchill had said. "Since that time, you, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization." It all started with that meeting on July 16, 1945, when a Missouri farmer met a British bulldog and recognized in each other something that transcended their differences: the strength to stand for freedom in the face of tyranny, the wisdom to know when to plant your foot down firmly, and the courage to do what needed to be done no matter the cost.